Well, good morning. As you can see, the title I think that you saw in your programs was something like Become a Commercial Drone Pilot, Part 107 Explained. And I want to give you an opportunity to get up and leave if you want to. I'm not going to give you any business tips to start a business or anything like that. We really are going to focus on 14 CFR Part 107, which, as many of you know, is required to actually exercise the privileges of a commercial drone pilot. So that's really where we're headed today. Jay told you way too much about me, but I spent most of my career as a law enforcement officer in Southern California. I retired in 2010 and took a position at the University of North Dakota, where I currently am. I'm an associate professor teaching pilot training courses. And then I thought I was never going to get back into law enforcement, but ended up going to work part-time for the Grand Forks Sheriff's Office. And my principal duty there is to supervise a regional unmanned aircraft systems unit. So we're actually going to start off there a little bit talking about law enforcement use of UAS very briefly, and then we'll dive right into Part 107, and we'll kind of dissect the most important subsections of Part 107 and hopefully give you a good understanding of that. All right, so we're going to just talk a little bit, as I said, about law enforcement use of UAS. We'll do a very brief overview of some potential commercial drone applications, and there are lots of them, so it'll be a very abbreviated list. And then we're going to spend the majority of our hour and 15 minutes here talking about Part 107 and dissecting it into its subparts. If the beginning of your agency begins with U.S., so United States, add the other part of your agency, you may be able to afford an MQ-9 Reaper. But local law enforcement, this is not going to happen. This aircraft starts off at about $22 million and easily exceeds $30 million depending upon the sensor system package. That is just outside the realm of local law enforcement and fire departments. What is more realistic is taking a look at a system that we'll see in just a moment. This is an even more disturbing image, and again, the media shows this quite frequently. This is an MQ-9 Reaper in a wartime scenario firing a Hellfire missile off a rail off the wing. So law enforcement does not arm their drones. It's solely used as a situational awareness tool, not as a weapon. Now, what are small unmanned aircraft systems? Well, the FAA has made this very easy for us. In August of 2016, they released 14 CFR Part 107, and it very clearly defined what a small unmanned aircraft system is. So it is a flying machine that's gross weight is less than 55 pounds. It's not capable of traveling any faster than 100 miles per hour, which translates to 87 knots, and is capable of downlinking some type of information to the ground. Most commonly, that's streaming video, but it could be infrared images, multispectral images, hyperspectral images. It could be data such as analysis of air, looking for hazardous materials. It could be sensing radiation with a dirty bomb explosion or a nuclear plant accident, that type of thing. In our particular unit, we're just inching up on about 200 deployments of the aircraft since 2010, and our most common call for service is to go out and work a serious traffic accident to help the traffic accident investigators document the accident scene and determine what happened, or to bring it out to serious crimes. And so we've worked 9 outdoor homicide scenes, and in many cases, especially over the last 2 years, we do a 3D rendering of that scene. So we're able to take hundreds of photos from both an oblique and an overhead angle, and then we crunch those together with some software called Pix4D, and it creates a 3D rendering, which we could literally walk a jury or a judge through the crime scene as if they were there right after the crime occurred. So it really increases the situational awareness of not only the investigators, but also of a jury or a judge later that has to try to determine what exactly happened here. Now, how widespread is the use of this in this particular application? Well, until April of last year, the answer would have been, we're really not sure. But Bard College, which is a private university on the East Coast in the Hudson Valley in New York, undertook a project to try to get their arms around how many public safety agencies, so police departments, sheriff's departments, fire departments, search and rescue entities, had acquired the technology. And they issued this report in April of 2017. You can access it at that URL shown on the right side of the screen. And what they found and their study went up to the end of 2016. At that time, approximately 347 agencies had acquired drone technology. Now, they did not try to determine how many were operationally using the technology, only how many had acquired it. And in talking with the principal investigator on the project, I'm convinced that his methodology was very sound and that this is an accurate number. So this was essentially at the end of 2016. They just updated it, and this is May of 2018. The number's now up to 910 agencies, which you're looking at that and you're saying, oh, the numbers don't really match. You say an 82% increase, but it went from 347 to 910. Well, what the researcher determined that there were agencies that he had not identified in the 2017 study that he later identified early this year, and so that's why this isn't much more than 82%. But he did determine that between the end of 2016 and May of 2018, there was an 82% increase in the number of public safety agencies that have acquired the technology. And a great deal of that is due to the fact that the FAA issued 14 CFR Part 107, which gave a lot of agency heads the security of knowing there's now regulations out there. We know what the rules of engagement are, where prior to that, we were waiting for regulations to come out. So a lot of organizations were hesitant to acquire the technology until they knew what the regulations were going to consist of. Now, as we break it down and take a look, you can see in a timeline there from 2013 to 2017, the growth in public safety agencies that have acquired the technology. You can see already in 2018 that we've got pretty substantial growth numbers there. Now, some of the takeaways. In 2016, more agencies acquired drone technology than had in all of the previous 5 years, just in 1 year. So that almost by itself indicates a period of exponential growth. It is growing at an exponential rate. Now, why is it growing at an exponential rate? Well, there are approximately 18,000 local and state law enforcement agencies. There are over 50,000 local and state fire departments, including volunteer fire departments. Of those 18,000 law enforcement agencies, less than 350 of them have manned aircraft. Of the 50,000 fire departments, less than 50 have manned aircraft. So what do you all think? What is the number one reason that more agencies don't have manned aircraft technology? Absolutely, Ben Franklin's. It's a very expensive proposition. And so the advent of drone technology, which is much more cost effective, from purchase cost to training cost of the personnel to hourly operating cost of the technology, is substantially less than manned aircraft. So this has given the ability to your local fire department, your local search and rescue team, to actually acquire the technology. Now, is it as capable as a manned aircraft? Can we do everything that we can do with a manned aircraft with a drone? And the answer is clearly no. In a study I was involved in at the University of North Dakota, the number we came up with was approximately 1/3 of the missions of a manned aircraft could be performed by a quadcopter drone. But we could do that for less than 4% of the purchase cost of a manned aircraft and less than 6% of the operating cost. So for a fraction of the operating cost, we could get 1/3 of the missions, which is not a bad cost-benefit analysis. So in May of 2018, as you saw from the graphic, 910 agencies had acquired drones. The most popular manufacturer is a Chinese firm, DJI. The reason for that is, again, cost effectiveness. They manufacture a very easy to fly group of drones for a very inexpensive price. Of those 910 agencies, 2/3 of them are law enforcement. The others are made up of fire and search and rescue entities. We're now at the point that there are more than twice as many law enforcement agencies that have acquired drones as are operating manned aircraft, which is pretty significant. Breaking it down, you can just see the percentages of the different types of law enforcement agencies. And then every state in the union now has at least one public safety agency that's acquired drones except Rhode Island. All right, commercial applications. And these are really limited by your imagination to a great degree, so this is we'll call it a non-exhaustive list, but commercial photography, infrastructure inspection, which in many cases can be completed much more safely with a drone than it could be using traditional methods. Towers are a good example. The traditional way of inspecting a tower was to send people climbing up towers, right? Relatively risky occupation. Now it can be done with a drone, taking multiple photos and doing photo analysis on the ground in a much safer environment. Surveying. Post-disaster insurance inspections, which can speed the assessor's evaluation of the damage to the property and therefore get you your insurance payment more rapidly. Crop inspection. Agricultural application, although it has not taken off in a large way in the United States yet, in other parts of the world it has. Japan uses drones quite extensively to apply pesticides and herbicides to crops. Media. For many, many years, only the largest markets, Los Angeles, New York, Miami, Atlanta, had media helicopters that were able to go to major scenes and pick up footage that you could watch on your local television. Now we're seeing media outlets in much smaller markets that can afford drones, put those up over incidents to enhance their coverage of stories in your particular area. Providing additional layers of security over facilities such as jails and prisons, as well as event security to try to keep you safe at a large concert, race, football game, that type of thing. And small package delivery, I don't know, to me this is probably got an awful lot of press coverage for something that's not going to happen in the very near future. So, you know, in my opinion, you're not going to see Amazon delivering a package to your home in the next 6 months. Will it happen eventually? Yeah, I think it'll happen eventually, but we have some technological hurdles that have to be cleared, but more importantly, we have some sociological hurdles that have to be cleared, which I think is the greatest limitation to package delivery. The technology, pretty much almost there. Sociologically, being able to secure those packages and so forth, we're not quite there yet. All right, so as I promised, let's dive into Part 107 here, and let's first of all talk a little bit about the genesis of the section. Where did 14 CFR Part 107 come from? Well, it had its beginnings back in 2008 when the FAA impaneled an ARC, short for an Aviation Rulemaking Committee. And that ARC consisted of industry experts, FAA experts, governmental experts from other portions of the U.S. government. They came together, did their work relatively quickly, started meeting in 2008, issued their report in 2009, and the report bears great resemblance to 14 CFR Part 107. So clearly they hit the nail pretty squarely with their hammer. Unfortunately, a number of years went by before much came of that report. So in 2015, the FAA issued a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, a statutory requirement in the federal rulemaking process. That went out for public comment, and during that public comment period, they received approximately 5,500 public comments that they were required statutorily to reply to all of those comments. That reply period and then taking in those comments into consideration in tweaking the rule resulted in the final rule being issued in June of 2016. And then that actually had to be published in the Federal Register for a minimum of 60 days, which resulted in the final issuance and enactment of the rule on 29 August of 2016. So that is kind of a quick synopsis of where the rule came from. Who does it apply to? Well, it was created primarily to enable commercial operations of UAS. Prior to this, you had to have an exemption to be able to operate drones commercially. And this was intended to be a much more inclusive way of allowing commercial operations of drones, and I think has proven to be a relatively effective way of enabling those operations. It can be exercised by government agencies. Government agencies can also use another mechanism called a certificate of authorization or waiver, or can choose to use Part 107, one or the other. They can't mix them. No mixing of the peanut butter and chocolate. You either choose to do a Part 107 operation as a government entity, or you choose to do it under a certificate of authorization or waiver. All right. Just a few definitions. I'm not going to kill you with PowerPoint and going through them, but just as we look at all of the parts of the FARs, we have some definitions just so we all are singing off the same sheet of music, and these are the definitions that apply to Part 107 as we're going through some of the subsections here. All right. 107.7, a couple of points here. One is when requested by the FAA, the remote pilot must make available their remote pilot certificate. Nothing surprising about that. Manned pilots have been dealing with that for pretty much forever. There is an interesting addition here, though, and that's this: permit inspection or test of the aircraft, pilot, and visual observer. Now, anecdotally, I haven't heard of this occurring, but as I read it in plain English, it would allow an FAA employee, safety inspector, to come up to you if you're exercising Part 107 and at a safe time when you've landed the aircraft to ask you a few questions about your operation. Potentially, what type of airspace are you operating in, or what are the capabilities of your aircraft, or what are your limitations under Part 107? And I find it to be an interesting section because it really doesn't have a companion section in Part 61 or Part 91 that would relate to manned pilots. So, interesting addition here in Part 107. 107.9 deals with accident reporting, and it requires the reporting to the FAA within 10 calendar days when events amount to an accident. So the next important thing is, what is an accident under 107.9? Well, it's when a drone is being operated and causes serious injury to any person or a loss of consciousness to any person, or causes property damage to something other than the UAS, very important portion of the section there, and that damage either exceeds $500 to repair or in the replacement cost. So we'll use a couple of examples here. If you're flying your drone and it strikes a tree and destroys your drone, and we'll say that you're operating a DJI Inspire, so we'll say it's worth approximately $2,500. Is that, and there's no injury to the tree, no injury to persons, but your DJI Inspire is completely destroyed, is that a reportable accident? No, that is not a reportable accident. Well, let's keep the scenario pretty constant there, but instead of striking a tree, you strike the windshield of a Maserati sports car, and you break the windshield. Now, I don't know what a Maserati windshield costs, but I think it's probably significantly greater than $500 to replace that Maserati windshield. How about now? Your drone's destroyed and you've got a cracked Maserati windshield. Do we have a reportable accident? Yes, I think it's pretty safe we do. The good news is it's very easy to report. You can go to the FAA website, FAAdronezone.com, or FAA/UAS, FAA.gov/UAS, and there is a link there that you can open up, and it'll bring up a mask in which you can report that accident online. So the FAA has made that very easy for us to comply with 107.9. All right, requirements for a remote pilot certificate. Well, if you're going to exercise 107, you either have to have a remote pilot certificate, and good time for us to talk about what you actually have to have in your possession. You actually have to have that remote pilot certificate in your possession. For those of you that are manned pilots out there, we're going to talk about how you can get one, as well as if you're not currently a manned pilot. But you're going to get a plastic card eventually in the mail. You have to have that in your possession when you're operating the drone. In addition, you have to have a government-issued photo ID, and you have to have the registration certificate for the drone. Those are the three documents that you must have at the operating site. The next is kind of an interesting subsection here. If you wish, you can have someone operate the drone under your direct supervision. So if you hold a remote pilot certificate, someone else can actually manipulate the controls of that aircraft. You just have to be able to take immediate control of the aircraft if necessary. Now, that could be done a couple of ways. It could be done just by your proximity to that other person, where you could maybe take the hand controller from them and take control of the aircraft. Or in some cases, the aircraft are equipped with what we call a buddy box, where with the flip of the switch, you have a separate hand controller, and you can now resume control of the aircraft if there's a problem with the person that you maybe are teaching to fly the drone. Now, interestingly, it doesn't say for training only. So could you be going out doing a commercial operation, have someone operate the drone who does not have a Part 107 remote pilot certificate? And the answer is clearly yes. But you absorb all the responsibility. You are the pilot in command. So if that person does something that violates regulations, that potentially is going to come back on you as the remote pilot in command. They are operating under your certificate, your authority. All right, UAS registration. Now, all drones that weigh greater than 0.55 pounds must be registered. If they weigh less than 55 pounds, you can use an abbreviated registration process, which is available online, again at FAAdronezone.com. You pay a small fee, and you can do everything online. The drone is then registered, and you can download a PDF and print out your registration certificate, and that's valid for 2 years. Now, reading this regulation, you might draw the conclusion that if it weighs more than 55 pounds, it doesn't have to be registered. That's not the case. It still has to be registered. It would not be considered a small UAS, and it would have to use the normal paper registration process and have an N number issued to the aircraft out of Oklahoma City. So to cut to the chase, the bottom line is all UAS weighing greater than 0.55 pounds must be registered. And all of that is found in Part 48, which was an emergency enacted section in December of 2015. So Part 48 deals with registration issues of UAS. Now, a few things there. You must be at least 13 years of age to serve as the registered owner of a drone. Now, it doesn't mean that a 12-year-old can operate an unregistered drone. That drone must still be registered. It just has to be registered by someone who is 13 years of age or older. Again, the registration can be done online. 2 places. The FAA is in the process of trying to move everything drone-related over to dronezone.gov, but currently shared space with the URL that you see up there, which is faa.gov/UAS. That registration number can be anywhere on the UAS. There is no minimum size it has to be or contrasting color, although all of those things would be good to have it, a size that's legible and in a contrasting color. But it can even be in a compartment on the aircraft as long as you don't need tools to access that compartment. And the reason for that is the Academy of Model Aeronautics was concerned and expressed their concern to the FAA that they have members that might spend years building, let's say, a scale F-4U Corsair, a World War II fighter. Everything absolutely historically accurate. And they said, but it's going to greatly detract from the historical accuracy of this aircraft for us to have to put this FAA registration number on there. And the FAA recognized that and said, we realize that, therefore you can put it in a closed compartment as long as you don't have to have tools to access that compartment. If your drone was registered in another country, it cannot simultaneously be registered here in the United States. So you would have to discontinue that registration and then re-register the drone in the United States. And if you transfer the drone or the drone is destroyed, Part 48 requires that you notify the FAA within 14 days of that transfer or that destruction of the drone. All right, subsection 107.15 tells us we have to conduct a pre-flight inspection. Again, nothing earth-shattering for manned pilots, but it clearly states the obligation for unmanned pilots to do this with their drone prior to flight. If at some point during the flight something occurs that makes you doubt the airworthiness of the drone, then 107.15 mandates that you land it and conduct an inspection. You can't continue with that flight. So what might happen? Well, a common occurrence would be maybe having a close brush with a tree where you went through some branches of the tree and you thought it was going to result in a crash, but it didn't. Miraculously, the drone kept flying. But would that make you doubt the airworthiness of the drone? And I would say definitely. You want to land the drone, inspect it, make sure that that brush through the branches did not cause any damage to the drone. All right. Now, prior to the enactment of Part 107, most government agencies were utilizing certificates of authorization or waiver, and those COAs required that the pilots have second-class FAA medical certificates. And at least we as an organization were very happy to see when Part 107 came out that that requirement no longer existed. So you do not have to have any type of a medical certificate to be a drone pilot. However, just as manned pilots are, prior to every flight, we have to do a medical self-assessment of ourselves. Are we mentally and physically fit to conduct this flight? Or is there something going on, a medication that we're taking, an illness, an injury that could negatively affect our ability to serve as a safe pilot in command? Clearly, you have that same obligation under 107.17 as a drone pilot. If there's something that makes you doubt your ability to safely conduct the flight, you need to basically decertify yourself and not fly the drone until that condition is remedied. Okay, 107.21 gives us the same ability that we have under Part 91 as a manned pilot to deviate from any regulation to safely resolve an emergency. If a request is given to us by the FAA, we need to submit a written report of that deviation. All right. 107.23 says that we cannot operate the drone in a careless or reckless manner that would endanger the life or property of another. So again, kind of taking this to the extreme, if you want to see what it looks like to fly your drone at 30 miles an hour into a brick wall, can you do that? Yeah, you can do that as long as there's nobody around that might be damaged by flying parts from that drone and the brick wall belongs to you. You can certainly do that. But when you start flying it in a manner that would endanger property owned by someone else or endanger anyone's life, then you would be in violation of 107.23. Now, another subsection in 107.23 tells us that we can't drop an object that would create an undue hazard to persons or property on the surface. So by taking this and looking at it from another perspective, can we drop something from a drone? And the answer is yes. We just have to take due precautions to make sure that we're not endangering property or endangering people on the surface. All right, operating from a moving vehicle or aircraft. So 107.25 clearly says we can't operate from a moving aircraft. I'm going to tell you, I've really wrapped my head around this one trying to understand what the rule makers were imagining here, because I can't really imagine a situation in which I would want to operate a drone from another moving aircraft, but can't do that under 107. We can operate a drone from a moving vehicle if we're in a sparsely populated area. So this would be, let's say, if you're out boating and you want to take some video of someone water skiing behind your boat. Can you legally launch a drone off your boat and video from the drone the water skier? And the answer is yes, as long as that is sparsely populated. You're not in a densely populated body of water. That would be perfectly legal under 107.25. All right, 107.27 primarily goes back to Part 91 and assimilates some sections related to alcohol and drugs there. So in a quick review of those, under 91.17, you may not serve as a required crew member within 8 hours of consuming an alcoholic beverage. So it's definitely not one of those. You can't say, here, hold my beer while I fly my drone, right? That's not going to be legal, right? So we're held to the same standard as manned pilots. We cannot operate the drone while under the influence of alcohol. We cannot operate a drone when we're under the influence of any drug, whether it be over-the-counter or prescription, that could adversely affect our ability to serve as a pilot in command. We can never operate an aircraft when we have a blood alcohol content of 0.04 or greater. A lot of times people look at this and think, well, wow, that's redundant, because the first thing you told us, Al, was you got to wait 8 hours from drinking to flying. But if you know a little bit about the assimilation of alcohol in the human body, you realize that if you, let's say, got to a 0.18, 0.20 blood alcohol content, which is not particularly drunk for many people, over the legal limit to drive, clearly, but many people can function at a 0.18 or 0.20. Well, at the rate that our body assimilates alcohol, it would be very easy to be well over the 0.04 limit 8 hours later. So that's where this section kicks in. You may very well be complying with the first subsection and you haven't taken a drink of an alcoholic beverage in 8 hours, but because of your blood alcohol content 8 hours ago, you haven't assimilated that alcohol completely, and you still have a greater than 0.04 blood alcohol content 8 hours or later. You have to submit to a chemical test if requested by a law enforcement officer. And then again, I've had students at the college say, wow, it doesn't say FAA there. And that's true, it does not say FAA, but in talking to friends who are FAA inspectors, they tell me, and it makes perfect sense to me, and if they were investigating something where they felt that a pilot was flying intoxicated, they would request a chemical test. If the pilot refused, then there's no administrative action they can take because of that refusal, but they would summon a law enforcement officer and then ask that law enforcement officer to make independent evaluation and make the request. And so it's going to happen. It's not something that you can probably try to hide behind the regulation and say, well, you're an FAA official, I don't have to comply with that request. Well, we can get a law enforcement officer here pretty quickly and make that request. So, all right, carriage of illicit drugs prohibited. Now, I really doubt that people that are smuggling drugs into prisons and jails are Part 107 certified, but if they were, then clearly it is prohibited under 9119, which is assimilated under 10727. All right, night operation. So this is a couple of our team members operating a Dragonflyer X6 at night. Under the basic Part 107 rules, you cannot operate at night. Now, I'm for the first time, and I probably will repeat it 2 or 3 times here as we go through the other subsections, there are waivers available for some of the more common things you'd want to do, and this is one of them. There are night waivers available to 10729, and in fact, it is the most common waiver that has been issued by the FAA to date to allow operation at night. But to go back to the basic 107, absent a waiver, does not allow you to operate at night. However, there is a little love in there. It says if your aircraft is equipped with anti-collision lights, you can operate it in the shoulder period 30 minutes before sunrise and 30 minutes after sunset. So we'd call those the civil twilight periods. And those can be done, you could conduct those operations during those 30-minute shoulder periods without a night waiver. The aircraft must be kept within visual line of sight. I know as a law enforcement agency, when we first got into this back in about 2010, we thought that was going to be a real significant limitation to us. It really has turned out not to be a significant limitation, because what we found that during the day, we can operate out to about a half a mile, depending upon the terrain and the amount of foliage, trees, bushes, that type of thing, but generally out to about a half a mile, and it's really limited just by the small size of the drone. Beyond that, without unassisted vision, using binoculars or something, we can't clearly see the aircraft. And the FAA has clearly stated this has to be unassisted vision. You can't say, well, I have it out there at 2 miles and I can see it clearly with my binoculars. That would not qualify. And there's a very sound reasoning behind that, because what the FAA wants you to be able to do is scan the surrounding airspace for other aircraft, a low-flying helicopter, a low-flying ag aircraft, and maneuver your drone to avoid conflict with that aircraft. Because the chances of that manned pilot seeing your small drone are very small. Really, the potential for collision avoidance, I would say 90% of that lies with the drone pilot. And my experience has been, I hear that manned aircraft before I see it. That draws my attention to the general direction, then I see the aircraft and maneuver my drone accordingly to try to avoid a conflict with that aircraft. So at all times, either the pilot in command, or if you're using a visual observer, the visual observer has to have the aircraft in sight. Now, that also does not mean that you can what we call daisy chain observers, because you look at this and think, well, you know what, I could put one visual observer out at a half a mile and another at another half a mile, and we could hand that off, the aircraft off, by utilizing the radio. Excuse me, the FAA has again said that clearly is not the intent of the section. The intent of the section is a realization that many small unmanned aircraft systems require you to be heads down looking at a display quite a bit. When you're doing that, by the very nature of that action, you don't have the drone in sight. So who could have it in sight? A visual observer. When you're using a visual observer, then you start getting into things like crew resource management and clear communication between the pilot in command and the visual observer about who currently has the aircraft in sight. Because one of the two, or you could have multiple visual observers, either the pilot in command or one of the visual observers needs to have the aircraft in sight at all times. All right, 10735 prohibits the operation of multiple UAS by one pilot. 10736 assimilates this rather long section under 49 CFR 171.8, which defines hazmat. And this prohibits the carriage of hazmat aboard a drone. 10737 is pretty simple. Those of you that are man pilots in the audience know that we've all had to memorize quite a litany of different cloud clearances and visibility requirements in different airspaces, and then also that the less maneuverable the aircraft, the more right-of-way that they have. Aircraft in distress always have the right-of-way. I mean, there's a variety of different rules that we've had to memorize. It's really easy for us as drone operators. All other aircraft have right of way over us, which is the way it ought to be. Those other aircraft have people in them. There's a higher risk there by the very nature that they have human occupants in them, so we should be giving right of way to those manned aircraft. Other drones, that is supposed to be worked out visually between the two drone operators, just like two manned aircraft operating in close proximity to each other. So, all right, operation over human beings. Cannot operate over human beings unless they're directly participating in the operation of the small UAS, or, thank you, or they're located under a covered structure. So if you're operating over a building and there's people inside the building, you're okay with that, or if they're inside a stationary vehicle. So in using some practical examples of this, you could not fly over a heavily traveled roadway that had vehicles moving on it. That would not be legal under 10739. You could operate over, let's say, an apartment complex with people inside the apartment complex. Not a problem with that. You could operate over a parking lot with people that were inside their vehicles. Obviously, it becomes a little problematic in how do I control that? When is someone going to exit the vehicle? When is someone going to exit the apartment complex? That type of thing. They might look at this and again think, wow, this is really a great limitation on me. You know, why did they do this? And gosh, it's going to really greatly limit my commercial operations. Well, I can tell you again, in the course of 200 missions, it hasn't greatly limited our operations in law enforcement, even though on the face of it, it looks like it might. Why is it there? Well, out of, again, we're coming up on 8 years of operation, we've had 3 aircraft that have just literally fallen out of the sky. And I'm not talking about inexpensive $800 or $1,200 aircraft. I'm talking about commercial, industrial grade drones that have had a mechanical malfunction and have crashed. And had someone been underneath those, there would have been a great potential for injury to those people. So when I look at 10739, I'm in complete agreement with it. Drones just have not reached the level of reliability of manned aircraft, and I truly do believe that they pose a danger to people that are underneath them. And so to fly over people, especially with, let's say, a quadcopter type of drone, that if you lose one blade or one motor on that quadcopter, it's only going to do one thing. It's going to uncontrollably crash to the ground. And if there's people underneath it, there's a great potential of injury to them. So you really want to heed this particular regulation. Now, does this mean you can't work, let's say, your kid's soccer game? No, it doesn't mean you can't film your kid's soccer game. It just means that you need to fly the drone in a place that doesn't overfly people. Don't overfly the soccer pitch. Don't overfly the bleachers where the parents are sitting. Find a place that you can hover the drone and stare back at the soccer pitch, or go up and down the sideline away from people filming the game. You can still incorporate the things you want to do as a hobbyist or a commercial pilot without overflying people. You just have to be a little bit more cognizant and situationally aware of techniques in which you can still capture the footage you want without having to overfly people. No, it's subjective, and it would come back to careless and reckless operation is what it would come back to. How close are you getting to that person? Clearly, there's not an altitude. Now, when we get into waivers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, there are waivers available for flying over people, and what the FAA is going to look at, is there a way for you to mitigate the risk? So let's say if it's an airplane type of drone, you might say, well, I'm going to be operating at 400 feet, and this airplane-style drone has a 22-to-1 glide ratio. That means that I could, at 400 feet, at 22-to-1, I could glide about 1,200 feet. And I've identified safe, unoccupied landing zones that are within 1,200 feet. So if I lose propulsion at 400 feet, I could glide to those areas away from the people. Those are the kind of things that the FAA would look at in risk mitigation in granting that. With a quadcopter, potentially a ballistic chute that deploys if a motor fails and allows the drone to come down on a parachute. That might be a mitigating factor that the FAA would consider in issuing a waiver to the flight over people rule.
And this rule not over people applies to 107 or not 107 if it's over.
Yeah, it applies equally to hobbyists, but it's not this section. This applies to operating pursuant to 107, but again, we go back to under Part 91, careless and reckless operations, and a hobbyist operating over people would probably justify a pretty good case for a safety inspector to make a case for a careless and or reckless operation. Yes, sir.
So does that mean you can't fly it over any road that cars are driving on?
No.
Highways I would get, but just the road, because that's a moving vehicle, right?
Sure. No, we've done that as well. Again, as a law enforcement agency operating pursuant to 107, we put a visual observer on the road. We've done it on I-29 in North Dakota. We want to cross over to the other side to work an incident, and we've got essentially 4 lanes of interstate we need to cross. We put a visual observer there. We brought the aircraft right up to, in this case, the west side of the interstate. We waited. He said, okay, you have about a half a mile break in traffic here. Cross now. We crossed over the roadway, got to the east side, never overflew a vehicle. So again, you just have to be a little innovative here. What you want to look at is what's the common sense way of mitigating a risk. And that's a common sense way of doing it. We have a visual observer telling us the roadway is clear. I'm not overflying moving vehicles that are occupied. I'm overflying a roadway that's unoccupied at the time. So that would be a potential way of doing that.
Okay.
All right, operation in certain airspace. So under 107, we can operate in Class Golf airspace, which is uncontrolled, and we can operate in Class Echo airspace that is not a surface area associated with an airport. Okay. All other airspaces, we need prior authorization from ATC. And the way the FAA would like you to get this is by going online, and there is an online portal for requesting access to this airspace. Now, there are better things coming. There is a program called LANCE, which is Low Altitude Airspace Notification. Essentially, the FAA is partnering with commercial businesses to come up with applications for smartphones in which ATC facilities survey the airspace around their facilities and determine what is the maximum altitude at which they would be comfortable with drones operating without having to have two-way radio communication. Then that information is relayed to these commercial vendors who incorporate that into software solutions for smartphones, and you're able to, using a GPS-enabled smartphone, say, I want to operate here, which is controlled airspace. You send a request, and it comes back with an authorization number to do that. It really, human hands aren't touching it. It's just now going and accessing that database of those overlaid grid maps saying, okay, the altitude you requested, let's say 100 feet AGL, is permissible under this grid map that we received from the local ATC facility, and they're comfortable with you operating in that area. So that program is being rolled out as we speak. It's operational in a portion of the country and becoming more widespread each month. And so that has a great deal of promise for allowing more rapid access to controlled airspace for Part 107 operators.
We got a question over here.
Certainly.
Do you know of an example of Class G airspace that goes up to 14,500 feet?
All I heard was Class D airspace, 14,000
Class G.
Class
on,
G.
On your previous screen.
Go ahead.
On the far left.
Yep.
That is colored to be Class G airspace that
Yes.
goes up to 14,500 feet.
Yes.
Where?
Do I know of it? A couple. I just personal places I've flown in New Mexico. There are areas where it goes to 14.5. A couple of places in Nevada. Very sparsely populated areas. And granted, it is somewhat uncommon, but I have personally seen examples where golf goes all the way up to 14.5, sir.
What about alert areas, like highly, like trading areas or MOAs?
Sure, get into those in just a second. Hold that question for just a minute, and we're going to talk about NOTAMed areas, MOAs, alert areas, that type of thing. All right, operation in the vicinity of airports. Now, there are airports that are Class Golf, right? Can you operate near those airports? Certainly you can. Is there an enhanced risk to manned aircraft? Certainly there is. And so 10743 says when we're operating in the vicinity of an airport, we have to give way to, of course, all manned aircraft and avoid traffic patterns. Same thing if you had an ATC prior authorization to operate in Class Charlie or Class Delta or even Class Bravo airspace, you still have an obligation to stay away from the flow of manned aircraft into and out of those airports. Now, just in case we don't get to it, let's talk about restricted areas, military operations areas, alert areas. Really, if you take a look at the rules for manned aircraft, those parallel for unmanned aircraft. So can we operate in an alert area? Absolutely. It doesn't require any authorization to operate in an alert area. Can we operate it in a MOA, a military operations area? Yes, we can operate in a MOA. Can we operate in a restricted area? Depends. Do we have authorization from the controlling authority? So if you have a military controller that has control of that restricted airspace, have you coordinated it with them? If they've given you authorization to operate in that restricted area, you can. And so nothing changes because we're a drone. Same thing with notices to airmen. You know, we have to comply with all those NOTAMs. A very common one would be NOTAMs that are placed up over wildland fires to protect firefighting aircraft that are dropping water and retardant on those fires. Oftentimes a NOTAM will go up over those areas. Are we exempt as drone operators? Absolutely not. In fact, the U.S. Forest Service will discontinue firefighting activity if there's a drone detected in the area for the safety of their water dropping aircraft. And so it's very important that we don't operate in those areas. But for obvious reasons, those are magnets for drone operators because it's just, you know, spectacular footage, right, of this wildfire. And so it tends to draw drone operators to there. But we need to realize that if we're operating the aircraft in a responsible manner, we really need to stay away from those activities because we're increasing the risk to firefighting aircraft that are trying to fight that fire. All right, so operation in prohibited or restricted areas, again, 10745, what we just said. Can you operate there? Absolutely, if you've got prior authorization from the controlling agency. All right, NOTAMs, we just mentioned that. So this is a super long NOTAM for the Grand Forks area, but we have the same responsibility that the man pilot has to avail ourselves of any NOTAMs in an area that we're flying and comply with those notices to airmen. All right, pre-flight action. So This actually codifies some of the things the FAA want us to do prior to conducting a drone flight. There's an expectation that you're going to check the weather, that you're going to determine what type of airspace that you're in, and any flight restrictions that may affect the airspace that you're flying in. You're supposed to do an assessment of the location of persons and property in the nearby area and have a plan to mitigate risk to those persons and or that property. Taking a look at any ground hazards. Is there snow on the ground, mud on the ground, tall grass, things that could affect the safety of your drone flight? Need to assess those and come up with a risk mitigation strategy. You're required to do a pre-takeoff briefing. You're required to do a linkage or connectivity test between the UAS and the ground control station. Is your ground control station talking to your drone? Anything that you've placed on the aircraft, like a camera or any other type of sensor system or external load, you have an obligation under 107.49 to make sure it's safely attached to the aircraft. 107.51 gives us all our operating limitations. We talked about a few of those in the very beginning. Our ground speed cannot exceed 100 miles per hour, which translates to 87 knots. We have to remain within 400 feet above ground level, except, and this is a pretty big exception, if we're operating within 400 feet laterally of a structure, that could be a building, it could be a tower, could be a chimney, we can go up to a maximum of 400 feet above the top of that structure. So this would enable things like infrastructure inspection. If you had a company that was inspecting tall towers, you could say you have an 1,100-foot tall tower. Can I only inspect the first 400 feet of it? No. If you stay within 400 feet laterally of it, you can go to the top of that tower. In fact, you could go to 400 feet above that tower. And the rationale here is manned pilots should be staying a reasonable distance away from those structures, right? And so there's some risk mitigation here where hopefully we're not getting unmanned aircraft into airspace that is being used by manned aircraft.
So I get this. Unmanned aircrafts have to remain within 400 feet HEL?
Unless they're within 400 feet of a structure, yes, sir.
So then doesn't that mean they can't really get into echo space? Because echo starts at 7 or 12 unless it's on the surface, in which case it's always with an airport, right?
No, there's a number of reasons why they could get into echo. So many class golf airports have echo extensions as well as deltas that further protect instrument approaches. So they bring the echo cloud clearances and visibility all the way to the surface. So there would be echo airspaces that you would be operating.
Into that, are they? Because that's echo at the surface associated with the airport.
They are with ATC authorization, with prior ATC authorization. Another way you could get into echo is if you had a tower. Let's say the tower was 800 AGL, and it was in an area where the echo came down to a floor of 700. If you, again, were exercising it, staying within 400 feet laterally of it, you would penetrate the bottom of the echo airspace. So again, admittedly, they're relatively rare instances, but there are instances in which you could penetrate echo, sir.
Okay, we got a question over here.
Go ahead.
If I violate by accident anything in 107, would that affect my airplane, commercial or private pilot's license?
Let me tell you what the attorneys at the University of North Dakota tell me about that. We have 4 aviation attorneys, and I've broached this question with them because I have a concern about it. I have an ATP that I'd like to protect. And then I have a Part 107 remote pilot certificate. This comes from them. This is what they tell me. If it is a violation of a regulation that would indicate moral turpitude, so that would be cheating on an exam. Let's say you went to take an FAA exam and you cheated on it and you were apprehended cheating. That could potentially affect all of your certificates. Okay, so if you were going for a Part 107 exam and you were silly enough to cheat on that and you were caught and the FAA pursued an action against you, that could affect both your manned and your unmanned pilot certificates. Now, if it is not a moral turpitude allegation, their opinion is no, it would not affect your manned pilot certificate. So if you went out here and did something exercising Part 107, let's say you purposely exceeded the 400 AGL limit, a purposeful violation and you were apprehended doing that, and a safety inspector brought an action against you, at least their opinion, these attorneys, is that would not permit an action against your manned pilot certificate, only against your unmanned pilot certificate. All right, continuing on here under operation limits, you have to have 3 statute miles visibility at the operating point. So wherever you're operating the aircraft from, where the ground control station is, that's where you would measure the 3 statute miles from. You might say, how would I do that? Well, looking at a sectional chart and seeing a tower that was 3.5 miles away, and then being able to say, I can clearly see that tower, I've got 3 statute miles visibility. Admittedly, a little tougher than when we're operating out of an airport, because oftentimes we have an ASOS or an AWOS or an ATIS we can refer to what the current visibility is. We're not going to have that out in the field. Cloud clearances, we have to remain 500 feet below the clouds, 2,000 feet horizontally, which is our normal fixed wing clearances from clouds. You notice there is no above the clouds measurement there because we should not be operating above the clouds with the drone. All right, remote pilot certification requires an application to the FAA. The way we go about doing that is we take an exam. If you are a currently Part 61 licensed manned pilot with a current biennial flight review, this will be the simplest rating you ever achieved in your life. What you're going to do is you're going to go to the FAST site, the FAASafety.gov, and on the Hot Topics link on the initial entry page to the FAST site, you will find a link to a 2-hour guided PowerPoint tutorial. And at the end of that, you'll take a short 40-question exam. You can't fail it because it just keeps bringing you back to Groundhog Day to keep answering the questions so you get them all right. And once you answer all the questions correctly, it will allow you to complete the course, and you can download a PDF of the completion certificate. You're then going to go into the Integrated Airman Certificate Rating Application site, lovingly called IACRA. Probably all of you by now have an account there. If you don't, it's very easy to establish. So it's the FAA site for the issuance or applying for certificates. You're going to populate an application there for a remote pilot certificate. As part of that, you will upload the PDF of your completion certificate that you earned when you completed that course on FAASafety.gov. You then have to go out and find your favorite flight instructor and have him or her log in to IACRA using your FCN to find your application. They're going to then verify that they've looked at your photo ID, that they have looked at your completion certificate for the remote pilot course, and that you otherwise meet all the requirements. Speak, read, and understand the English language and so forth. They're going to then verify that you do meet all the minimum requirements. It's going to then have you log back in. You're going to acknowledge the pilot's Bill of Rights and submit the application. Right? It will, within an hour, you will have a remote pilot certificate available there. You can download that temporary, which is valid for 120 days, and within that 120-day period, you will get another plastic card in the mail, which is valid for 2 years. Okay. That is the breadcrumbs for a manned pilot. For those of you in the audience who are not manned pilots, it's almost as easy, but there's a little different step in the beginning. Instead of going to that FAASafety.gov site, you're going to study for the exam. The FAA on their dronezone.gov site actually has a prep manual there. There are a number of commercial companies out there that have robust prep courses put together. I know John and Martha King are speaking after me. They have a very good course out there. Gleim has a course out there online, as well as a prep manual. ASA has a prep manual. So kind of many of the usual suspects out there that have been helping us study for FAA exams for years are into this market now. You can self-study for it. There are some commercial courses out there available as well that you can take in a in-person course and prepare for it. That exam has 12 knowledge areas on it, everything from meteorology to radio communications to performance and aerodynamics. Once you've studied for that, you go take an exam at the FAA Testing Center, PSI CATS. It's a 60-question exam. You have an hour and a half to take that exam, and you have to make at least a 70 on it. Once you've taken that exam, then it starts to become a little bit more like the manned pilot route. You go to IACRA, you populate an application, but you don't have to involve a flight instructor. You merely put in your specific test ID code for that exam you took. After about 24 hours, the two computers talk with each other, so PSI CATS will communicate that information to the FAA. It will recognize that you've passed the exam, and it will accept your application. Little longer wait, though. Instead of an hour, it's going to take 7 to 10 business days, because the FAA turns your information over to the Transportation Security Administration, who vets your name against the known terrorist database to make sure they're not issuing a remote pilot certificate to someone they know is involved in terrorism. So that's the process to, if you will, finish this up, whether you're a manned pilot or someone who doesn't possess a manned pilot certificate. Those applications can also be made at a Flight Standards District office, although I would suggest to you that that is a more cumbersome process. It is much easier to use IACRA and do it online. So that remote pilot certificate is again valid for 120 days. Then we come into something that the FAA is calling aeronautical recency, and we're just coming up on that because the first remote pilot certificates were issued in August of 2016, so they're coming due for renewal in August of 2018, next month. How do you renew them? You have to take the exam again. And there are refresher exams out there now that cover 7 knowledge areas instead of 12. Manned pilots can do that at FAAsafety.gov, and persons who do not hold a manned pilot certificate go back to a testing center and take a refresher exam that consists of 40 questions and covers 7 of those knowledge areas. Now, you will not be issued a new certificate. You don't have to go into IACRA. The way you show your currency is by holding on to either that course completion certificate that you achieved in FAAsafety.gov or your test report that you were given by the testing center. So now that's what shows your recency of experience. No new certificate. And you have to retake that exam every 24 calendar months to maintain the recency of experience of your remote pilot certificate. All right, and the last thing that we'll talk about here is what happens if you fail? What if you go take this exam at a testing center and you fail? Well, the only thing you have to do is wait 14 calendar days and you can retest. Presumably during that 14-day waiting period, you are doing some study over the areas that you were remiss in. There's no endorsement needed. You still don't have to involve a flight instructor. You just bring in your previous test report that's dated at least 14 days prior. Okay, change of address, just like with a manned pilot, you have to report it to the FAA within 30 days. And then finally, last thing we'll put up here and then ask for a couple of other questions. These are the sections that the FAA has identified are available for waiver. You apply for a waiver at FAAdronezone.gov. They ask that you do that at least 90 days prior to your anticipated operation date. And in running the data the other day, as of 21 July, the FAA granted just under 2,000 Part 107 waivers, and the overwhelming majority of them were for 10729, which is for night operations. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks, Al.